In the last lecture, we discussed humanism in the Italian Renaissance and how humanism became almost the ideology of the elite in cities like Florence in Italy, and ultimately provided a way of viewing and dealing with the world that permitted fundamental change to happen and a serious challenge to the established structures of the traditional world of feudalism and the manorial economy. Also, though, I mentioned that it was extremely important to note that every institution was challenged, and indeed the fundamental institution of Western civilization, that is the Roman Church, was challenged as well. In fact, it became a point of particular challenge given the set of circumstances that were unique to Italy and unique to the West, and created a circumstance in which the Church found itself in the most difficult situation that in fact it had ever been. Well, during the early Middle Ages, as I suggested, the uncomfortable union between secular and ecclesiastical power worked itself out because of the ambiguity of authority that was implicit in the nature of feudal society. Well, this ambiguity, in fact, spread not just in the rural world of Northern Europe, but even in the Italian cities, where the position of bishop and high ecclesiastical office were also fought over by the most powerful and the richest families as adjuncts or extensions of their authority and power. And during the Middle Ages, this happened to the papacy itself, the bishopric of Rome, which was, in theory, the headquarters, the central office of a universal Christendom in the West. After 1054, the Pope ruled the West and was recognized as the chief among bishops. So to have that position challenged and to have the position of the papacy itself thrown into disrepute meant that in fact the whole structure of the Roman Church was called into question, the effects of which we will see in a subsequent lecture. The city of Rome was another one of those mosaics of Italian states. It was an unusual one because it was a theocracy in many ways. The Pope chosen by the Holy Spirit during conclave, but nevertheless it was another part of that divided and fragmented Italian peninsula. And just like so many other fragmented areas, there was struggle for power and authority. Powerful families in Rome, the great families who were often great aristocrats on the outside of the city who had vast estates, struggled with one another over not just influence over the territory of Rome itself, but also over powerful ecclesiastical office. The result was that there was violence in the city, and by the early 14th century, the position of the Pope was thrown into a great deal of danger because of the constant struggle over control of the papacy, control of the church, but more importantly, the wealth that the church represented. It was in this context of danger and of instability that Pope Clement V in 1305 decided that he needed a place to hide. He needed to escape Rome and to find a place that was secure where he could live in a measure of comfort and freedom. Clement was a Frenchman by birth, and he chose a place associated with the Kingdom of France. It was an independent enclave of Avignon, which had been a gift of the Queen of Naples, and Naples itself was a fief of the papacy. So it was papal territory, but it was on the Mediterranean, the southern coast of what is now France, and it was a place where Clement felt he could have a measure of security and comfort. He never intended to stay, but in fact, he did. The movement of the papacy and following the Pope, the offices of the church to Avignon by 1308, meant in fact that the beginnings of the Babylonian captivity was in place. The Babylonian captivity takes its name from the servitude of the Israelites in Babylon, and it was used as a model, as an example, and in fact a negative example of what was happening to the Holy See in this difficult circumstance in which the church seemed to be subject to powers outside of its own control. When Clement died in 1314, there was hope that perhaps the next pope would return to Rome, but it didn't happen. Another Frenchman was elected, and one Frenchman after another succeeded Clement, so that between 1305 and 1377, the headquarters of the church, the Bishop of Rome, was not in Rome, the place of the martyrdom of the apostles Peter and Paul, but in Avignon, in the south of France, living now in a great palace surrounded by very, very comfortable circumstances and a great luxurious and, in fact, from many points of view, corrupt way of life. This circumstance, then, was something that was a significant challenge to the church. Not only was it against canon law for the bishop to not be resident in a see, but when the bishop is the pope and separated from that connection that linked the papacy to Constantine and the establishment of a Christian empire, that associated the Pope with St. Peter as first Bishop of Rome, and that separated out that memory of Rome as the center of the world, the caput mundi, from the church. It was a dangerous and difficult position indeed. The Babylonian captivity, moreover, separated the church not just from its traditions, but also to some extent from its moral bearings. Petrarch himself wrote a very scurrilous book called the Liber Sine Nomine, the book without a name, in which he described the kinds of things that happened at the papal court in Avignon, the sorts of things you'd never learn in catechism class. Petrarch was very, very clear in his rejection of the moral temper of the Avignonese papacy, despite the fact that he actually was part of it on a number of occasions, and he achieved a great deal of renown and patronage as a consequence of that papacy itself. But nevertheless, the model of the papacy was in fact being seriously challenged. It was challenged as well because these are the years of the 100 Years' War. It was the division of Europe between the powers of the French and the powers of the English and their allies fighting one another in that terrible war that lasted until 1453. During that terrible war, it was believed by the English that money sent to Rome to support the church actually went to hire French soldiers to fight the English. It wasn't true, but nevertheless the belief was there because the Pope was French. The Pope had a plurality of French cardinals. The Pope on occasion was a relative of the King of France. And the Pope was also closely associated geographically with territory that the English were challenging. So there was a division also based on politics, that the papacy seemed to be playing one side over another, that the papacy seemed to be siding with the enemies of the English. And so the English and their allies began to question the authority of the Pope because of this danger. There was then a movement, a powerful movement, to return the papacy to Rome. It began especially with two charismatic female saints, two remarkable women who still are part of the panoply of European hagiography, and those are St. Catherine of Siena and St. Bridget of Sweden. There's a reason why Catherine of Siena is the patron saint of Europe, because of her desire to establish the papacy as the center of not just a Roman church, but as in fact the moral center of an entire community, and give the church again its moral power and its authority. So Catherine of Siena and Bridget of Sweden preached before Pope Gregory XI in Avignon, telling him he had to return. And finally, in 1377, Gregory XI agreed. He would return to Rome, where in fact he was greeted with great celebration and hope that finally the bishop was reunited with his flock and that Rome would once more recover. The situation in Rome also complicated the papal return. Not only had this violence and instability driven the Pope out, but with the papacy gone, the violence and instability continued. And indeed, there was very little by way of government in Rome. The city had become broken. It had become almost a small town of just 20,000 people huddled around a malarial swamp in a bend of the Tiber. The city was a company town. Rome didn't produce anything. It didn't make anything. It served the universal Roman Church. And with the headquarters of that church elsewhere, the city began to slip into decay, economic and social and political. This is the situation that Gregory XI saw when he returned. The Lateran Palace was uninhabitable. Many of the churches had lost their roofs and were not functioning as churches at all. The city was unkempt, the city was dangerous, and there was need to establish some kind of authority. But Gregory made a mistake. He made the kind of mistake that leading statesmen often do when late in life they're faced with a challenge. He died. With the death of Gregory in 1378, just a year after returning the papacy to Rome, the situation was left in a very, very precarious circumstance. It was precarious because there was still a plurality, a large plurality of French cardinals. And there was a sense among these French cardinals that returning to this dangerous, unstable, unkempt, falling apart city in Rome, where they had no comfortable place to live, and leaving their beautiful palaces in the south of France where the wine is so good and the sun always shines. This was in fact something that was made clear to the Roman population. Moreover, the Roman population knew that their only economic hope was to return the papacy. Otherwise, the city would continue to decline. The number of pilgrims had declined, and all of the things that kept the Roman economy functioning had been seriously jeopardized by the Babylonian captivity. So they did what they felt they had to do. During the conclave to elect the successor to Gregory XI, the populace of Rome rioted. They rioted around and demanded that an Italian be chosen because they thought their greatest hope for keeping the papacy in Rome was to have an Italian pope rather than a Frenchman whose natural proclivity would be to return to Avignon and once more abandon the city. The result was, in fact, an Italian was elected. The very old Archbishop of Bari, a learned and pious man, found himself as Pope Urban VI. This situation then really crystallizes the kind of challenge that we've seen so often in the past lectures about the breakdown of traditional society and the breakdown of authority. What we see here with the election of Urban VI is the introduction of not only a popular element of riot, but also the challenge to fundamental institutions coming about because of these instruments and vehicles of change. The Babylonian captivity had shaken the church to its very foundations. And the election of Urban was supposed then to have recovered that, to have rebuilt the church based on its Italian roots and reestablishing it in Rome. But it was not to be. Why did the election of Urban ultimately lead to an even greater scandal, a greater danger, a greater challenge to the Roman Church? Urban, as a cardinal, had been known for his intelligence and his piety, but he also is known for his uncompromising personality and his moral inflexibility. Many of the French cardinals were in fact of those great aristocratic and occasionally royal families that expected a good life. They had not chosen to enter ecclesiastical life, but they had been placed there as surplus sons. And they wanted to live comfortably with their catamites and with their concubines and their great palaces, with their servants and their beautiful things. Pope Urban tried to impose some measure of canonical living on them, tried to change their ways in order to reconstitute a Roman papacy with Roman traditions that would be linked in apostolic succession back to St. Peter, who was, after all, just a fisherman. The French cardinals would have nothing to do with this. The French cardinals were so appalled by the high-handed activity of the Pope that they revolted, and they then said that the election of Urban was invalid. It was invalid because it was under duress. The rioting of the people of Rome demanded they make a choice of an Italian. It was not the dove of the Holy Spirit who whispered in their ears the name of Urban. It was their fear of retribution if they did not elect one of the few Italian cardinals. So the French cardinals stole out of Rome and went to a fortress outside the city. And there they declared the election of Urban to have been unjust. He was to be deposed, and they then had another conclave and elected one of their members as a new pope, who of course immediately returned to Avignon. What would be the only response of Urban? What could be the only possible reply that Urban could make to this schismatic act, but to excommunicate those French cardinals, to declare that the pope that they had elected, now resident in Avignon, was in fact an anti-pope, and indeed the Antichrist, and all faithful should ignore them until they could be properly punished. Real ecclesiastical authority and the apostolic succession remained in Rome. Well, Urban may have said that, but the French didn't listen. Moreover, because of the continuing circumstances of the 100 Years' War and the political and military alliance systems of Europe, a large number of nations identified as the real pope, the Pope in Avignon, whereas their enemies then identified the Pope in Rome as the real Pope. What we have now is the schism, a terrible moment in the history of the Church, where there was not just a Pope resident outside of Rome, there are two popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, each claiming to have the full authority of the apostolic succession, each claiming to be able to bind on earth and on heaven, each excommunicating the other and labeling the other the Antichrist and insisting that they be fully accepted by the faithful. The situation, of course, was desperate. The situation was more than desperate. It was critical and dangerous because Europe lined up according to the alliance systems that hovered around the alliance systems in the Hundred Years' War. Both popes then continued, and the death of either one, the one in Avignon or the one in Rome, made no difference whatsoever, because their respective conclaves simply elected another pope, and up until 1417, there were two popes. This situation of the schism was a desperate moment, because the very idea of having two heads of Christendom that both claimed to be the successor to St. Peter, who was believed and accepted as Christ's vicar on earth, was in fact a desperate moment indeed. The faithful didn't know whom to accept or whom to believe. There were two buses in the parking lot. Both said to heaven, but you knew that one was going to heaven and the other one was going to hell, and you didn't know which one. But the political circumstances, an accident of geography, really required you to get on one bus or the other. The simple faithful, not understanding any of this complexity, were simply left in a state of spiritual confusion. And this ate away at the foundation of the church itself, and at especially the structure and the hierarchy of the church. It was the greatest challenge the church had faced up to that time. Well, there were attempts to address this problem. There were attempts that failed for a number of reasons. The most dramatic was when a group of cardinals from Rome and a group of cardinals from Avignon in 1409 got together at Pisa in order to try and solve the problem of the schism. These were well-meaning men. These were good men, and they believed that they had the best interests of the church at heart. But meeting in Pisa, declaring the Pope in Rome deposed and the Pope in Avignon deposed, meant in fact that they simply elected a third pope, and there was the ultimate absurdity after 1409. There were three popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, one wandering around Italy looking for a home. This desperate situation, which had reached the level of absurdity if it hadn't been so spiritually dangerous to the population of Europe, and also to the institutions of Europe, all of which were informed by the idea of the church. They were informed by the structure and implications and interaction of the church. The ambiguity of the secular and the religious that characterized medieval society had not been addressed. It was still there, and it affected everything. We can see how it was affected most dramatically in Bohemia, one of the kingdoms attached to the imperial crown. There, a popular preacher, following the theological model that had been developed in England by John Wycliffe, began to question a number of the assumptions of the Roman Church. This man, Jan Hus, questioned, for example, whether the church should hold wealth at all. Why should the Bible not be in the vernacular so that common people could read it and they could learn from it? Why did the entire church have to be mediated by a closed caste of priests? What, in fact, was the role of the church in terms of politics and in terms of local governance? Well, John Wycliffe had raised these ideas among his followers, known as Lollards in England, but because England was a secure and stable and homogeneous country, there was no particular difficulty. Wycliffe died in his bed. But Jan Hus was preaching this in a very, very volatile place. Bohemia was ruled by the Holy Roman Emperor. It was one of the kingdoms that not only elected the emperor, but was part of the imperial crown. The emperor, more often than not, was German. The bishops, consequently, were often German. In fact, the high episcopacy and much of the leadership of the Bohemian church was German. The people, though, were Czech. They spoke a different language, and they had no direct connection with these powerful clerics who often received their bishoprics and all of their emoluments and perks as gifts from the emperor in reward for service or as payment as imperial counselors. So Hus, by challenging this role of the church, was not just challenging a theological construction, he was challenging the very nature of the Bohemian church and Bohemia as part of the empire. If Hus had been accepted and believed, the cutting of Bohemia from the imperial crown could in fact have happened. As a result, he was seen as particularly dangerous. Huss had to be dealt with. And in fact, it was this issue, almost more than any other, even more than the theological absurdity of having three popes, that drove the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund to act. Sigismund required that there be a solution to the Hussite challenge and danger, and the only thing that he could see that would solve this would be, in fact, a general council of the church. General councils, after all, had been used by the emperor to solve problems before. The great early councils of the church, such as Nicaea in 325, was called by the Emperor Constantine. It wasn't called by the church or the pope. And in the instance of 1414 and the calling of the Council of Constance by the emperor, he had in fact an ally. The second pope, elected by the Council of Pisa group, was a most slippery individual. A man named Baldassare Cossa, who had begun life as a pirate and a brigand, and he realized the chances of his keeping his role of pope were extremely slim. So he then agreed with the emperor to resign and to help call this conference that would allow the issue of the papacy to be solved. And indeed, this pope, who had the name of John the 23rd, not of course the great Roncalli pope of the 1950s, but the first John the 23rd, he was labeled an anti-pope, and so the number was not retired. This man still enjoys my favorite papal deposition. John, sometimes pope, of whom it is said, sodomy, incest, and murder are the least of your crimes. And indeed, in terms of Baldassare Cossa, that indeed is true. Although he does have a great monument, and that is the tomb by Donatello in the baptistry in Florence, one of the gifts that he received for agreeing to give up his papal title. So John and Sigismund decided to call a council that would address this problem, this fundamental problem in the church, and that is having three popes, three heads, the division of Christendom, the dilution of the authority of the church itself, and the weakening of its central office. The first issue that had to be resolved was Huss, because after all, the emperor was very concerned about what was going on. John Huss was invited to come to Constance to make his points before the full council of the church. And he was given an imperial safe conduct that promised him complete security. Huss, perhaps naively, went to Constance with two of his leading followers, and they put their case before the emperor and the council. As soon as they finished, the safe conduct was withdrawn, and they were burned at the stake. And Huss was killed in his body, but his ideas continued to live on. And indeed, the death of Huss caused a much worse situation, because it then led to the rise of Hussitism, which was not just a religious but also a political and social revolution of the Czech people against the Germans in the imperial crown. But the burning of Huss and Jerome of Prague and his other followers didn't really address the problem of three popes. It solved a problem for the emperor, but it didn't solve the problem of the church. This is something that required the active engagement of the entirety of Christendom. Really, not since the calling of the First Vatican Conference was there such a union of people from around Christendom gathering in one place. But here they weren't looking at elements of theology. They weren't discussing the articles of faith. They were looking at organizational structure and how the papal monarchy, the papal theocracy, could in fact be overruled by the body of the faithful. And ultimately, a deal was struck. John the 23rd, Baldassare Cossa, resigned. The other two popes were taken out of office, and they were no longer recognized as popes and added to that very long list of anti-popes. And in their place, one man was elected, and that was the person to become Martin V, who had the improbable name of Oda Colonna. But he was a Colonna. He was a member of one of the greatest Roman families, and as such, he brought a natural authority based on a Roman power base to the papacy. It was a brilliant choice, and Martin, in fact, was an excellent pope. So in 1417, the schism had been addressed. It had been addressed through the instrument of a council called by an emperor and an antipope. And it was this idea of conciliarism, of seeing the church as not a monarchy based upon almost a feudal example of a pyramid with the pope at the top ruling theocratically over the entire church in any form, in any absolute way he chose, but rather the church more like a republic, in which all of the faithful could participate and bring a set of values that would be applicable to everybody, including the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. This idea of conciliarism then entered the Roman Church and again further weakened the concept of a hierarchical church based upon almost a feudal model of power, in which the ones at the top could in fact do largely what they would. The election of Martin V did solve the problem, and solve the problem with some measure of success. The city of Rome was once more derelict, having 3 popes and having insufficient income, having the problem of dealing with the problem of schism meant that the pope in Rome was not able to rebuild the city. So Martin was not able to return to Rome until 1420. And when he did return, he found the city again in ruins. And he spent much of his papacy trying to re-establish not just the power of the papacy and the authority of the pope, both moral and political, but also to establish a working bureaucracy to make sure that papal taxation was once more being collected, that the money was being spent appropriately, that pilgrims would once more come to the city and they would be housed and they would be able to visit those special places where the martyrs in fact had suffered. The reestablishment of the papacy in Rome then took a great deal of time, and took time under the influence of, and heavily and very, very deeply informed by, the fact that the nature of the Roman Church had fundamentally changed as a consequence of conciliarism, that the council had chosen a pope. The council, moreover, had made Martin agree in the famous bull Frequens that he would accept regular meetings of the church, regular councils, and that there would be performance reviews of the pope by these councils to ensure that he was not acting high-handedly or acting in any inappropriate manner. So there was an attempt then in this time of challenges, in this moment when all of the institutions of the West were being seriously challenged, in which even the Roman Church itself was being renewed to some extent and also responding to a series of dangers so profound that it shook the church to its very foundations. Conciliarism did not last. Conciliarism was ultimately again destroyed by the power of a monarchical theocratic papacy, and the concept of the Pope as a theocratic absolute monarch survived. But nevertheless, in this time of challenges that we're discussing, it was a significant moment because it indicated that every institution, every practice, regardless how sacrosanct, could be called into question because things were no longer working and there had to be new ways of solving these problems. And just the search for solutions added a dynamic to European society that really started moving along and providing an engine for change that would ultimately explode in the 16th century. We're going to see to some extent the context of this challenge and the context of this revolution and the vocabulary in which the revolution took place in our next lecture when we talk about Christian humanism. What we'll see is that the humanist ideas that developed based on pagan classical antiquity in Italy took on a different form in the North, where education was largely the monopoly of the church and everything had a clerical cast. Moreover, the problems that we have seen, the problems of the Babylonian captivity and the schism, were particularly powerfully felt in the North because of the close union, almost the identification of religion and of the intellectual and cultural world. These things were so closely bound together that it was difficult for Northern Europeans to separate them in any way whatsoever. So Christian humanism, when it developed, when Christian humanism then took on its own particular form and its own particular energy north of the Alps, we will see a challenge to the church in another way. A challenge in which, again, fundamental assumptions could be made, could be challenged. Fundamental assumptions could be questioned simply because problems were identified as so great that there needed to be a reform, not just of institutions, but of individual spirits, where the individual souls, in fact, now had to address this issue and had to address this problem. Heretical movements had already formed. We had seen this with John Huss, but he wasn't alone. Gerhard Grote and the Brethren of the Common Life also arose in the 14th century, and so many others. So many of these challengers saw the church not as a structure in an institution, but of individual souls, and the battle was going to be increasingly not for institutional hegemony, but for the souls of individual believers and Christians. And this, together with the rhetoric and the effective learning of the Christian humanists in the North, would ultimately lead to the next great revolution of Europe, which is the Reformation, not accidentally happening in Germany, north of the Alps, and led by many of those who identified themselves as Christian humanists.